Great. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Putting Family History on the Map. Before we get started, just a few things we need to go over. First of all, we acknowledge that the Boston Public Library's Central Library stands on land that was once a water-based ecosystem providing sustenance for the indigenous Massachusetts people and is a place which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange among nations. We are committed to land acknowledgements for all locations at which we operate. We reaffirm this commitment to set the context for our planning and deliberations, and public engagement will take place from the spirit of welcome and respect, found in our motto, free to all. So just a few reminders here. So this program is being recorded. I will be sending a link to the YouTube recording once it is ready. It might be a little while though. Our AV folks are very, very busy, but I will send that to everyone who's registered. I am now putting a link into, I put that in the wrong thing. I'm putting a link to the handout in the chat. The chat box is open, so if you're having any technical issues or if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in there. You can also use the Q&A box. Okay, so today we have with us Ian Spangler and Megan Nally. Ian is a cultural and economic geographer with interests in digital mapping, historical geographies, and race and landscape in the US. He is a geography PhD candidate at the University of Kentucky and assistant curator of digital and participatory geography at the Leventhal Map and Education Center. Megan is a recent graduate from Wesleyan University and holds a BA in Government and Hispanic Literatures and Cultures, as well as a certificate in International Relations. As a public engagement coordinator at the Leventhal Center, Megan has a strong interest in public education and hopes to explore the dynamic between historical narratives, contemporary issues, and public attitudes. And with that, I will turn it over to Megan.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Jessie, for that introduction. That was wonderful. We're so excited to be here, and thank you to everyone who's joining us this evening to tune in for our Map Nerd Family History event. Once again, my name is Megan Nally. I'm the Public Engagement Coordinator at the Leventhal Map and Education Center, and I'm joined by my colleague, Ian Spangler, who is the Assistant Curator of Digital and Participatory Geography. Hello, Ian. For tonight's program, I'll be giving a very brief rundown of who we are, what we do, and how you can access our resources. And then I'll be passing it over to Ian so we can dive specifically more into mapping family history. And with that, let's move on to the next slide, please. Great. So the Leventhal Map and Education Center is a geographic research and education nonprofit located within the Boston Public Library. As such, we operate in a very unique, funky relationship with the library to manage the historic map collection. We're kind of like a cousin and inside at the same time. The collection, which totals more than 250,000 objects, covers a wide range of geospatial and geographic materials, including sheet maps, atlases, globes, surveys, plans, blueprints, and even a few board games. The collection is global in scope and dates back from the 15th century to the present, but has particular strength in maps and atlases from the New England region, the American Revolutionary War period, nautical charts, and world urban centers. Next slide, please. As the stewards of the map collection, our work takes many different forms, which is very exciting. We run public programs on neighborhood history. We lead workshops on digital mapping in GIS software. We host geographic scavenger hunts and trivia nights for anyone who wants to join us next time. And we do much more. Our education team offers K through 12 programs, both on site at the Map Center and in the classroom, as well as teach it yourself lesson plans and professional development opportunities for educators. Here you're seeing a photo of our gallery space as well as our learning center, and then a little screenshot of some students playing with a map puzzle a few weeks ago in Boston Common. Next slide, please. A very large part of our work, and the part that some folks might be familiar with, are our exhibitions. Exhibitions offer a really fantastic way for us to showcase a variety of collection items while reflecting on a particular topic through a geographic lens. You're seeing in front of you the title and kind of first introductory panel of our current exhibition, which is titled More or Less in Common: Environment and Justice in the Human Landscape. This show focuses on the geographic relationship between environmental management and historic patterns of injustice. And within that, we're looking at topics like housing and transit, environmental engineering in Boston, green space, public space, and what climate vulnerability and resiliency, looks like. For those who are local to Boston, we would love to welcome you to the gallery in person and have you visit and see the show. But if you're unable to come in person, we do have an accompanying digital exhibition online with all the same objects and stories. Next slide, please. So within our wide variety of projects and programs, we have this kind of consistent driving question that kind of backs up everything that we do. And that's, how can we use maps and other geographic materials to kind of piece together and document different, both distant and contemporary histories? And not histories that are geographically close by, but histories that are on more of a global scale as well. So to encourage a wider use of our resources, we've created this digital collections portal that you're seeing in front of you, where anyone, anywhere can access almost 10 or at least over 10,000 digitized collection items. And on the portal, you can search by year, you can search by topic, by geographer, if you know a name, and we can walk through a few examples. So for the fun of it, let's do a search, Ian, for Boston, because that seems to make the most sense. So it looks like we have 9,517 results for Boston, which you could take the whole time to search through. But to make your lives easier, you can toggle by year, you can toggle by subject, and you can spend hours on here. And that's exactly what we do all day. Another fun search that I find myself doing pretty often is for pictorial maps. That's something that I really love to look at. So here we're seeing a few. The one of Loveland in the upper right corner is particularly fun. So on this page, you can zoom in really fine detail. You can read a small description about it. It'll list the publisher, the year, everything like that. Does anyone from the audience have anything that you'd like us to search while we're here? We can do maybe a few examples and then we'll get back to on track. But if not, I'm happy to move on. Boston in the 1910s, it looks like. Ian, can we do another search for Boston? And then toggle the years. Let's see. And so with this, the search itself is not perfect. It will get you in a kind of focused area that you want to be in, but you have to sometimes be creative with your search terms as well. So it looks like we're seeing a few. Very cool. I'm seeing some beginning atlas plates, which we'll get into later. Here we're seeing steam railroads, it looks like. 1818. Very cool. It looks like we have another, we'll take one more request and then we'll move on. Something of anything of Canada is what we're looking for. And for those requests that we don't get to tonight, you can access this on your own time. Please feel free to spend as much time as you would like looking into other searches. Oh, that one's pretty cool. I like the colors on this. Vancouver, looks like. Southern Vancouver Islands. So this feature of zooming becomes really helpful when we're talking about specifically family history, because on certain maps you're able to zoom in so close, and we'll see this later, to see the property owner of who was maybe residing at a certain place or who owned a certain property lot. Very cool. We have some of Portland, city center. Some more Vancouver. Nice. In the interest of time, we can move back to the slides, and then we can move on to the next one. So along with our own digital collections portal, there are a lot of other digital resources that we turn to most of the time. This particular resource is called Digital Commonwealth, which some of you may be familiar with. It houses hundreds of thousands of digitized photographs and manuscripts, books, videos, audio clips, really anything you could possibly think of. And they've been collected from a variety of cultural institutions and historical societies across the state. And here at the Map Center, we often turn to Digital Commonwealth when we want to further visualize something that we've found on a map. So say we locate a building or some geographic feature, but we want to physically be able to see what it looked like at the time. This is the perfect way to use Digital Commonwealth. And so I'm going to walk us through a pretty brief example of how I went through this process a few months ago. So I was tasked with looking into the industrial history of the Neponset River. For those in Boston who, right after the EPA designated it as a Superfund site, we were just interested in the history of the location. So my initial search brought up this 1890 pictorial bird's eye view map of the Milton Lower Mills area. And around the border, you're seeing really finely detailed pictorial representations of different businesses, homes, churches, things like that. And if you just click to the next slide, Ian, that would be great. And here on the bottom border, there's something that really stuck out to me, and it's an image or an illustration of the Walter Baker and Company chocolate mills. And I grew up in the area and I had no clue that we had a history of chocolate. So I clearly had to dedicate my entire search into just Boston's chocolate history. So I then went to Digital Commonwealth. Ian, you can go on to the next slide, please, and found a handful of different objects that were super fun and super interesting to look at, different postcards, different advertisement cards, aerial photographs of the complex. And this is just a very brief and very surface level example of how you can start with a map and take it and kind of form and reconstruct this other history. And we're going to talk about how we can do this when it comes to family research and local research. And I think with that, I will pass it on to Ian.
Thanks, Megan. Sorry, had to find my unmute button for a second there. Yeah, thank you for this great overview of kind of getting started with our collections. I just dropped a message into the chat that we do have maps that cover all of these other topics as well. So feel free to explore that at your own convenience or reach out to us at any point if you need guidance or want to learn more about how to access these materials, whether it's online or in person. We're open 6 days a week, so very flexible, and happy to answer any other questions via email or otherwise. So we hope to see you all soon. For now, I want to pivot over to talking a little bit more directly about family history and local history, and how you can use some of the maps in and beyond our collections to dive into these topics, right? So I want to start with thinking about doing research with land ownership and survey maps. These are maps that might be called county survey maps, might be called cadastral maps, which just means they capture property ownership over a certain area. These maps typically were quite popular in the 19th century. You'll find a couple in the 18th century, but at that point, not a lot of maps captured property ownership. And for obvious reasons, this is really useful for folks who are interested in doing genealogical research and attaching family history or place names to particular parcels of property. One thing that I love about these maps is that they also kind of pry open other moments of discovery, right? We often tell people that the maps that we have and the tools that we offer are just as much about finding answers as they are about raising new, exciting questions. And I think that these land ownership and survey maps often do this. You see here on the right-hand side, and I have another image of this that is a little less grainy, I promise, that these maps typically showed a variety of different features consistently, things like political boundaries, roads, railroads, villages, maybe industrial places like mills and factories, and then community institutions like churches and schools, as well as property ownership. These maps often have several enlarged inset plans of main villages within a particular county. And you'll see that even though this is Massachusetts, right, this is focusing on the county level, so it contains a wide variety of different towns. And moving on to the next slide, you can actually see on this bigger version down here in the bottom right corner that these insets over here relate to specific town centers. So I've zoomed in on Sudbury here on the left-hand side, just as an example of what these maps look like when you dive into them. You'll actually note that these little spaces in between the map sheets themselves is the cloth backgrounds that they've been pasted on. These maps were huge. They were between 5 and 6 feet square. So you can imagine how difficult that is to store and roll out and actually examine. They were lithographed in separate parts and then mounted on one piece of cloth. So this is, again, a great example of that process. You'll also notice on the right-hand side here that the maps typically capture different kinds they might show a view of the city and a bird's eye view of a landscape or important places on the maps. Sometimes these highlight general community institutions, and they also might highlight folks who helped to sponsor the map because this kind of work was not always was not free, of course, at the time. This map was made by a man named Henry Francis Walling. He's a very prominent surveyor in the state of Massachusetts, and if you head over to our collections portal and click on his name, you'll find somewhere in the neighborhood of 70 or 80 maps of Massachusetts and New England similar to this. So him alone, he's a great resource for doing research on historic forms of property ownership that aren't specifically focused on cities and urban centers, right? So I think of this as sort of helpful for doing rural research. I don't think that rural is necessarily the right word, but it's not strictly urban, right? We can see that some of these areas that are clearly not urban, maybe not even suburban. Not that those are all that useful categories in 1856, but places by Gulf Brook Meadows, right, have some names attached to them. So if you're looking for history and family history using these maps, they can be really productive for that kind of exploration. Another note is that these maps predate lots of the kind of typical multi-sheet atlas that you might think of when you think about doing this kind of research. And we'll get to that later on, but the multi-sheet atlas is largely a response to unwieldy 6 by 6 foot square maps, such as these county surveys. Just another example of this, and I zoomed in on, is this, I think it's Dover, maybe, I'm not sure what I zoomed in on, but this is a map of Norfolk County. Another Henry Walling map. This one is actually from our collections. The previous one is from the Library of Congress's map division. And while I mentioned that, we have an extensive collection of all kinds of survey maps, but we are not the only institution. And as you're doing this kind of research, you will probably find it productive to explore other collections too. The Library of Congress has probably got the most extensive set of fire insurance atlases in the world, and they're all digitized and available for you to peruse at your convenience. Again, this is just an example of the kind of maps that might be useful for you. It dives quite deeply into this plan of Roxbury down here, the map of Norfolk County. So, and this is again from 1853, so mid-19th century maps predating atlases that do detail both urban centers and more rural areas, as well as place names. I think it's always interesting to see how place names might have changed over time. So these maps also serve as a kind of gazetteer of historical information. One more zoomed in map that is not, or I think this is this from the, yeah, this is from no, this is a different map. It's just a map of Wrentham, Norfolk County. So this is not a county survey map, but another Henry Francis Walling map that focuses just on the town of Wrentham. So while you can access the county survey maps that provide a quite wide scope, there are options for this kind of work and for maps in the 19th century that focus more specifically on urban areas. And you can see in 1851, the Wrentham Common had been established. We have a lot of information, not just about property ownership here, but also about the kinds of institutions that were extant at the time, things like shoe shops and tailor shops. So this is kind of fun information that contextualizes social life at this time. And I think that these can be really useful for doing all kinds of exciting research. One other thing I wanted to point out, this is kind of a mishmash of screenshots here. So if you actually head over to the US Department of the Interior's Bureau of Land Management website, you'll get a somewhat more accessible and readable version of this, but it captures the information that I want to convey, which is that if you're looking for information outside of Massachusetts, for example, on federal land conveyance records from that era, these are really useful. In particular, land patents, they contain a lot of information on the conveyance of land titles from the federal government to individual people. One thing that I want to note about this, before I move on to our fire insurance and real estate atlases, is that these kinds of maps have all sorts of limitations for what you can discover, right? They're not a catch-all source of archival discovery. And I think this is a great example of the ways that the resources that we can access in the archive, even through the Map Center's collections, are implicated in the processes of land expropriation and settler colonialism that are still with us today, right? These land patents, in the same motion, they are useful pieces of data as we piece together stories about maybe genealogy, maybe different kinds of local histories. They are evidence of expropriated indigenous territory that I think is important to frame all sorts of historical research in the US. So bearing that in mind, and knowing that that is something that undergirds all of these conversations about land and property and territory, I want to pivot over to talking about the fire insurance and real estate atlases, which brings us kind of from conversations about more rural, maybe more towns outside of the greater Boston area to Boston, especially. So a little bit about our urban atlas collection. In essence, these are the next generation of county survey maps. Instead of creating these big 6x6 sheets, we now have books, right? That all of these maps have been surveyed and plated out into separate pages, making it a little bit easier to access, store, and parse than those giant county survey maps of the past. That said, they are still kind of bulky and challenging to work with. This is a photo of some of the atlases that we have digitized and turned into, used to create a digital tool called Atlascope that makes discovery with these a little easier. You can imagine that even taking one of these, I probably should have put my hand in there for reference or something. These are very big books. They're heavy. They take up a lot of space and they're quite fragile. So navigating them and doing research with them requires care and patience and a little bit of strength. So we wanted to think of a way to make these atlases more accessible, and especially think of a way to make it easier to walk through time with them, right? The most effective use of these atlases is as a tool for showing change over time. And, dealing with one of these atlases is hard enough. Dealing with 2, 3, 10 can be incredibly unwieldy. So a little bit about fire insurance and real estate atlases. These in our collection cover roughly the period between 1860 and 1940. And while the primary benefit of them for genealogical and local history research is stuff like family names and ownership information. They have a great deal more information attached to them, things like old addresses, street names, and even building materials, whether something was built with brick or wood. The reason for that is because especially the fire insurance atlases were, there was a lot of money and capital on the line, right? Fires were one of the big problems of urban life in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Boston, we have some maps showing the Great Boston Fire that displays a burned district in the city, just as an example. So this is something that is even close to home, right, for us in Boston. The real estate atlases, on the other hand, they weren't necessarily used for fire insurance purposes, but it was important that they were very accurate and fine-grained because they were required for tax assessment and tax valuation. So there was a lot of money riding on these atlases. Their audience was folks who, maybe worked in government or worked in the insurance and finance industries, who needed them to be very accurate. That's useful for us because it gives us a pretty fine-grained glimpse into what the geographies of the 19th and 20th centuries actually were. Again, just like with the county survey maps, there are things that are always left off these maps. So considering what kinds of absences are here is just as important as thinking about what the maps can help to make present. That said, I want to give you a sort of glimpse of what it looks like to turn these into a tool like Atlascope, which I'll be showing you in a couple minutes. The first step is digitizing them, taking a really nice camera and putting them on a server somewhere so that you can access them through our collections portal. This is what that looks like. You can click the button to read it online, and it'll bring you to a page that lays out each atlas plate in a grid. These atlases will have a sort of title page that corresponds each plate to a specific plate number, or each area to a specific plate number. A street index, which is really useful. And, at that point, you start to thumb through and see each of these shows the block level geography of a particular area. In this case, we've got an atlas of Roxbury. G.W. Bromley was a very prominent real estate and cadastral atlas maker during this time. So that those atlases constitute a great deal of the collections that we have that are popular with patrons at the Map Library. Zooming in a bit more deeply onto this, this is this plate right here. This raises some other challenges of doing research with these maps, right? So we're looking through here. These numbers of the sheets themselves do not correspond to the actual plate number that is represented on the map. So that alone it kind of adds another layer of figuring out how to access the plates themselves. But now that we're here, we can see that this has a lot of really rich information, distinguishing, for example, between brick and wooden buildings and structures, noting green space and open space like a cemetery that's owned by the city of Boston, and specifying ownership of distinct property parcels. So while this is great, it's not perfect, and that was where Atlascope came in. Atlascope is a tool that helps us take scanned images like these and turns them into real geographies. So what I want to do now, before I jump into Atlascope, I just want to make a note of two research guides that you can use as you engage with our historic urban atlas collection. One is Urban Atlases of Massachusetts Towns at the BPL. This guide, as well as the one that I'll show you in a second, were both written by our wonderful reference and cataloging librarian, Lauren Chen. And they contain excellent instructions for how to dive into the different atlases and kind of make sense of them. So this one is a guide for all of Massachusetts. The next one is a guide specifically for real estate and fire insurance atlases in Boston. You'll note that the easiest way to find urban atlases at the BPL is by using Atlascope, and this is true. This is indeed true. Right now, Atlascope only covers the greater Boston area. We're actively working on creating a sort of Atlascope 2.0 that has coverage of more towns in Massachusetts. Our dream is to have a version that covers the entire state. So having said that, let's kind of jump out of the slides and hop over to Atlascope itself. I'm going to go ahead and start at BPL. Atlascope is, you can access it yourself just at atlascope.leventhalmap.org. Start at BPL, and it brings us to this landing page. We're looking at an overlay from 1874 of the area of the blocks down in Back Bay surrounding the Boston Public Library. I'll kind of break this down in sections. This big chunk here is our sort of map canvas, right? We've got a spyglass through which we can look at the old map. We can make it bigger, make it smaller. And then we can start to change the content of this map canvas with the controls down on the bottom panel here. Maybe we don't like the spyglass. I know that a lot of people, even in the map center, prefer to use a swipe. So we can change that to an X or a Y axis swipe. I'll leave it on the spyglass because it might be weird, but I'm sort of fond of it. You can tweak the base map and the overlay maps here. And this is where it gets really exciting. Let's go ahead and start to change the map that we're looking at inside of this spyglass. Atlascope automatically defaults to to the earliest available full atlas of the area. You'll see that we could look at 1870, but it's really an edge map that just covers some territory over here. So if we jump up to 1882, we'll see that we've actually gotten a lot of development starting from what was 1874. Property specific parcels had not been carved out yet. By 1882, you do see that we've got parcels and even some more detailed registers of ownership. This is all sort of coming together as the Back Bay infill project is wrapping up. So in the 1874 map, you can see that we still have some traces of before the infill over at the Fens was completed. Skipping ahead even further, we can jump up to 1890, for example, and see that now we've really got some information filled out here, and the Boston Public Library has appeared, where the map center is located if you ever want to come visit us. Changing this against the base map can provide some really interesting insights too. So now we've got a view of 1874 in comparison with 1890. And this allows us to, Atlascope allows us to continue walking all the way through time up to the most recent available atlas, which for this view is 1938. You can see how this provides a lot of really powerful insights into all sorts of research questions, whether they have something to do with local history, whether they have something to do with genealogy, or anything else that you might be curious about in the city of Boston, Cambridge, Somerville, like I said, the greater Boston area is here. If we zoom out just a little bit further, I always like to do this to give a sense of scale. So when you zoom out all the way, you can see these polygons, these footprints, which each one of these footprints represents one atlas. Jumping back over to that, that picture, right? Each one of those footprints represents one of these books. We geo-referenced about 100 of these atlases, which means we told a computer that a certain pixel in the scanned image, right? Like this, for example, we told a certain pixel in this image, let's take this one, for instance, this corresponds to a latitude and longitude in real space. And we ran some geospatial workflows to transform these atlases into a continuously mosaicked tool that you can use for this kind of discovery. What I want to do for the rest of, we have about an hour left. I want to take us through a couple of kind of specific examples of stories that you can tell using Atlascope. And then by way of conclusion, we want to turn it over to you all and sort of search some addresses that you're curious about as a group. We'll try to get through as many as we can. And just a reminder that after this call ends, Atlascope isn't going anywhere. So you can check this out again at your convenience, and we're always here to help you make sense of what you see. So I want to start. You can search Atlascope by clicking this button down on the bottom left corner. This is plugged into something called a geocoder, which just pulls address data so that you can search it like any old Google Maps or Apple Maps. I'm going to start by searching Northeastern and take a look at some of the histories attached to this area. So this spits us out to 1873. So we've got pretty early coverage for where Northeastern currently sits. Like I mentioned before, this shows us a couple of things right now. Even comparing it to modern geographies, right? We can see that there is a whole lot of watershed and drainage basin that is no longer here today. A lot of this was infilled in the late 19th century, largely as a public hygiene project. This area by the Charles River was, if you come visit us in the gallery at our exhibition, More or Less in Common, you'll see a map of foul odors in the city of Boston. And this area was, in fact, one of them. It had become sort of a dumping ground for all sorts of heavy industry. And a lot of this space was filled in as part of the Back Bay Fens project, which was a Frederick Law Olmsted project. It was initially named Back Bay Park, but because he wanted it to be viewed more as a sanitation effort than a project for recreation, it was renamed the Fens. Going back to Northeastern over here, we can also see that these checkered or dotted lines represent that nothing has actually been built here yet. This is just speculative. So it's showing us where property is being laid out. Another fun thing about this is that these sort of half circles are typically really good markers of railway stations, and they're identifiable through time on these maps. Let's start to go for a little walk through time and see what changes. By 1882, we're starting to see a little bit more ownership laid out and some property parcels established, though not a ton yet. 1890, now we've got the infill in this area has been completed. It's starting to look a lot more like modern Boston, but we still don't have Northeastern here. Wondering when that'll appear maybe. So we can keep on going. Let's jump up to 1899 and see what happens. So we're getting more property partitioned and parceled out. Jumping into the 20th century, we now see we've got a baseball ground here, which is kind of interesting. I didn't notice that before. And this is still all owned by the Boston Elevated Railway Company, which shouldn't come as a huge surprise given that it's right on the border there. Let's skip ahead to 1928 and just see what we see. So now we've got, this is kind of interesting. We've got the Durant ink. I know what this is. I'd be curious to hear if anybody here knows the history behind this, because it's something that has been very curious to me since doing some of these searches a few weeks ago. So in the area, we've now got the Durant Inc. that owns a lot of this property. And we've got a YMCA building. I wonder, so this all appeared in, looks like 19, maybe 22? Nope, 28. So 1928 is when this appears on Atlascope. It may have been here before, but this is when it appears on Atlascope. Jumping ahead to 31, we see that there's still no Northeastern, although we do have Northeastern University of the Boston YMCA. And by 1938, we just snuck in there with the building footprint of Northeastern University before we ran out of maps. I think that this is a really useful case because it shows us a couple of things, right? It shows us that it shows us some of the origins of Northeastern, right? That this was originally part of the YMCA that bordered the territory that now is where Northeastern University sits. And it also shows us that some organization called the Durant Inc. used to occupy this land. I was curious about what this organization was, so I gave it a little search, the Durant Inc. But this didn't look very promising. Durant Performance Coatings, 5 stars, which is great, but not what I'm looking for. If you're doing any kind of searches on Google, you can always bound your search in quotation marks if you want it to return an exact match. So let's try that. And this gives us something that looks a little more promising. So we've got some meeting minutes from 1926. That definitely matches our time frame here, 1931, 1928. We've got some writing about the Durant Inc. that pops up in an old medical textbook. And we've got this one, the Massachusetts Teacher, which mentions the Durant Inc. I really like this because, well, just because it's an interesting case, right? So the Durant Inc. offers a practical course on posture. Turns out this must be an organization that does a sort of cotillion, maybe a cotillion-like courses and programs for quote, school nurses, social workers, teachers, and others who work with children. It is indeed located at 336 Huntington Avenue. So now we have an even tighter time frame for when this was established. And if you wanted to read more and learn more about what the Durant Inc. was, you could look in here, right, and see what some of their sort of parameters and ideas about proper posture, health, and nutrition were. I love this case because it shows us a couple important things about using AtlasScope. One, that it really is a tool for discovery. We started, when I first did this search, I was just looking for the history of Northeastern and discovered something really interesting about an organization that I wasn't familiar with. It also shows us how we can use additional materials to bring AtlasScope out to its fullest potential and really enrich the maps that we have there. Maps are often just starting places, and they can really be made useful and generative when brought into conversation with other historic documents like this, or like Megan showed earlier, searching Digital Commonwealth to see. I actually haven't searched it. I wonder if they've got anything in here. Now, doesn't look like it, but if anybody, I would love to hear if anybody has personal connections to that organization. I think that it shows us really interesting things about gender divisions of labor and who they sort of expect to have good posture, what that means, and the kinds of professions that they're targeting. School nurses, social workers, teachers, and others who work with children are typically anticipated as feminized labor, especially in the early 20th century. So that all comes from a kind of one-off search for Northeastern and AtlasScope, which I think is really, really exciting and a very fun use of this tool. This is obviously a more of a local history example. So I wanted to pivot over to one that is still kind of local history. You know, we can't necessarily do family history demos properly. That's something that we would love for you to take a crack at with the tool. But we can search for sort of histories of famous people in Boston. So what I want to do with this one, well, actually, before I even dive into that, I want to bring up a set of AtlasScope stories that a group at College of the Holy Cross used last year, led by Amy Finstein in a course about making the modern city. You can find this on our website. It's an article called Before Displacement. And the course basically took a critical look at infrastructure building projects in Boston, especially the Central Artery, and then the Big Dig that followed that, and looked at what was there before these infrastructure projects fundamentally altered the landscape of the city. And so we have this great set of vignettes and student research projects that kind of dive deeply into different examples of things that you can learn on AtlasScope, right? we're looking right here at dead center of the expressway, right? This used to be Clinton Market, a fish oil factory, right? Provides a different way of viewing the historical geographies of the city. This one I think is really fascinating, that looks at brothels before the Big Dig in, I think, the North End. So thinking about a lot of people are often surprised by how many property parcels are owned by women across Atlascope, especially in the early to mid 19th century. So there has been all sorts of kind of intentional and targeted inquiry by fellows and students and users of Atlascope to dive into some of those interesting questions using these maps. So yeah, that said, I want to pivot back over to Atlascope and take a look at some of the histories of the Harriet Tubman House. The Harriet Tubman House was originally located at 38 Holyoke Street. So let's jump over there. You can see 1874 was a little early for this to appear, but we do have the property parcels here. Jumping ahead a little bit, 1895. It looks like we still don't have anything named here yet. And this is a good example too of some of the challenges of Atlascope, right? So 37 Holyoke puts a point on the map right here, but you can see on the map itself that that is not what the address was in 1895. So the geocoder that we use only maps onto modern geographies, and that requires a little bit of finesse sometimes to ensure that you're looking at the right places. So 37 is right up here. It might, I think that it started in the early 20th century. So we've got nothing yet, but eventually I know that it moved to 25 Holyoke Street. And I wish I could rotate this for you so that we could read it without kind of craning our heads. But if you can manage to read upside down, then you'll see that this parcel right here says, it does say Harriet Tubman House, beginning in, I think, 1908, but I can't quite remember. Yeah, so looks like it appears first in 1912. As we continue to walk through time, we'll see different kinds of changes with this landscape, but I do want to pull up an image of the house as another example of ways that you can pair different kinds of historic materials to aid this discovery. For context, the Harriet Tubman House, if you're not familiar with this, was a sort of lodging hall and a lodging home for that was founded in response to discrimination of Black folks in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. It was founded by 6 Black women from Boston, especially Julia Henson, who ultimately, when the house moved from 37 to 25 Holyoke was her property. So she they founded this house as a place of lodging for Black women specifically who had recently migrated from the South. This was, you might think of this as a sort of community-oriented space of lodging similar to something like the Green Book, but it also became a really important cultural institution in the South End. And this snippet from Northeastern, I couldn't actually find what year this was, but it shows some details about the house and a photo of what the facade looks like. I would guess maybe, this is somewhere between 1930 and 40, 20 and 40. I'm not really sure. If anybody knows, I would be fascinated to hear. Pivoting back over to Atlascope, the sort of history of this house, in 1950, 5 other houses formed the Federation of South End Settlement Houses. So the Harriet Tubman House became part of a larger network of lodging. And in 1960, the Harriet Tubman House, along with those other homes, combined to form United South End Settlements, which still exists today. I actually found the 1959 consolidation document in which all of the homes were sort of consolidated into United South End settlements. So you can see that it was composed of the it was composed of Hale House Association, Harriet Tubman House, Lincoln House Association, etc., and provide some specific legal details on what happens in 1959 when this consolidation occurred. In 1976, the Harriet Tubman House moved to 566 Columbus Avenue. If we look that up on Atlascope, we don't really get much. I took a crack at it. And, we have, even if you go all the way up to 1938, it looks like Linnie B. White owns this. So it actually had been in the White family for some time. In 1917, I think Margaret White, it looks like, owns this property. Also, I'm just as a point of order, these numbers that appear inside are square footage, I believe. So just another example of the kinds of data that you can retrieve from these maps. Here's a picture of the new house at Columbus from 1978. So this is the Harriet Tubman House after it had moved to a new location. Many of you may be familiar with some of the protests over the last few years against the demolition of that building, which ultimately was torn down in 2020. There's some great writing about community history and community organizations and activist organizations such as I Am Harriet, and coalitions who basically worked, unfortunately, in vain to try and preserve the building. But there's a whole fascinating history associated with the legacies of this house. And I think that this example in particular is a great way of sort of bringing these older histories and geographies into the present day and thinking about how tools like Atlascope and some of the maps that we have in our collection can be paired to understand ongoing contemporary conflicts or questions. I think that brings us right about to the end of what I wanted to talk about. I know that we've got a lot in the chat here. Maybe I can, I'll start by passing it back over to Jesse. Jesse, I don't know if there was anything that you had questions about here
Nope. We do have a few requests for specific addresses in the chat box. Let me scroll back up here. Let's see. So someone's asking for the West End prior to its destruction in the 50s.
Yeah, that's a really popular one on Atlascope. So let's make this really small here. So we're right about the West End, sort of this area. Atlascope will drop you sort of arbitrarily when you search for a neighborhood. So if there's a particular address, we can dive into that too. But we can look at this in a couple different ways. So the first available one is 1867, and just the sheer density, right, of housing in this area is kind of shocking when you zoom all the way out. Maybe if we switch to a swipe, we can compare it to right here, for example, the West End. There's a garage that used to be bounded by at Leverett and Green. That used to be a number of different housing units. Moving through time a little bit here, can see that I mean, this was all densely populated for a great deal. Not sure how much it was. Yeah, there we go. So we still have a lot of content here in the 20, although Mass General, when does that appear? That's been here for a long time, I suppose. Yeah.
So we do have a couple of requests for places other than Boston. Is that something you're able to do with Atlas Scope, or is it just Boston?
So we can search. It sort of depends. If it's close to Boston, we might be able to do it.
Okay, so well, let's give it a shot
Somerville
then.
can do it.
So someone's asking for 39 Hudson Street in Somerville.
Yes, 39 Hudson Street would work. Somerville. There we go. Great. So this we've got a long history here. It looks like. Hopefully this brought us to see. Actually, this looks like it's another case where addresses have changed. So today, 39 Hudson Street is right here.
79. I'm sorry. It was 79.
79. Super. Let's rework that. 79 Hudson. You said.
Yes. Oh, I'm sorry. Wait a minute. Hold on. I'm mixing it up here. 39. I'm sorry.
Oh, it is 39. Okay.
I was
great.
mixing it up with the next request. Sorry about that.
You are totally fine. 36 Hudson. Let's hop back over there.
39.
This is a good example of how the addresses change. So this right here is 39 Hudson Street today. It looks like in 1874, this was 26, 27 Hudson Street. 39 was a little further up here. But we can start to walk through the atlases here. It looks like around this time, what you'll notice in especially the 19th century atlas scope plates is that great swaths of territory were sort of owned by the same folks. And you'll often notice that as time goes on, streets and triangle parks start to take on the names of those property owners. In this case, I'm not sure if the Dickerman estate ends up, making its mark on the cultural landscape, but at any rate, let's click through this a little bit. So we've only got 2 atlases here, unfortunately. This is one of the challenges, right? Boston has a lot of dense temporal variety. Once we get out into Somerville and Cambridge, it starts to get a little thinner. So skipping ahead to 95. So what we've got here, it looks like Charles Clark owned this property in 95 and 74. We've got the Stearns and Sprague, I think, families in this area.
Okay, let's see. Okay, so next, 79 Appleton Street in Boston.
79 Appleton. All right, this is another very old original, right? We've got 1874 is the first one. Let's jump up to the 1885 Sanborn and see what happens. So this still is just property parcels, but nothing has actually been claimed yet. I don't think. Let's see. Actually, maybe the Bromley will show us. Yeah, there we go. So this is, it looks like 1888, owned by, I'm not sure, Harriet, maybe, Harriet Flag. Can be tricky to read this stuff sometimes. That Sanborn had an interesting annotation here, 3 stories of French roofs. So they're just another example of the sort of careful annotation of features, right? And we can think about that in the context of what the audience of these maps would want to know, right? This 3 stories of French roofs must be something that was relatively important for risk assessment and companies that might be giving out fire insurance at the time. Continuing to walk through, looks like this changes. Oh, so it stays in the Flag family. I think this is Charles, maybe, up to 1908, 1912. Still remains 1928. It looks like it's shifted to Charleston. And by 1938, it is still in Charleston.
Okay, so let's see. Our next one is in the Q&A box, 50 South Margin Street in Boston. They're specifically looking for around 1900.
Super. 50 South Boston. Sorry, 50 South Street.
50 South Margin Street.
Margin Street. Okay. Let's try this one. I mean, we might have to poke around a little bit here. North Margin Street. Is this the, I don't know if this is the area. I would assume it might not be the right one. I'm just not getting a South Margin.
It sounds familiar. Let me see if I can figure out where that
I may be able to look on Google.
looks like it's in the North End.
Okay. Let's see here.
I'm not sure. I think South Margin might be one of those streets that doesn't exist anymore because I'm just getting hits for North Margin now.
Yeah, that's what I'm getting too. It is. I am seeing it in the North End though.
Yeah, so I guess it was in the North End.
Yeah, let's see. Well, let's in 1867.
So Amy's saying if she thinks it's near Leverett Street or Chambers Street.
Okay. Let's see. Around 1900, you said. So we'll grab the 1902. There's North Margin, Stillman, Leverett or Chambers.
I'm seeing that South Margin Street was removed during urban renewal in the 1950s. So
Oh,
you
that makes
should
sense.
be able to find it
Yeah.
in these atlases, but
It's probably, if it's in the North End, maybe it's
it says South Margin and North Margin represented the margins of the former North Cove, which I am not familiar with, but I'll keep digging.
yeah, this is an excellent request, right? That shows some of both the challenges of searching and using AtlasScope and figuring out how these geographies changed over time, and also some of the like really exciting discoveries that you can make with this tool. You'll see as we scroll through these kind of darker lines are where the atlas plates touch, by the way, just as a point of order.
Okay, all right, let's see. Maybe add one more. Okay, so this is one they're looking for specifically in Middlesex, Massachusetts.
So this is the full extent of atlas plates that we have on AtlasScope.
Okay.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's what I was afraid of.
Yeah.
Okay, so unfortunately, it looks like that one's not in there.
Yeah. But it is
Okay.
something that we are working towards incorporating, though it'll probably be a little while before we get to all of Massachusetts.
Okay, so then I have a few people, looking for Westwood and East Longmeadow and Springfield. So, okay, so this I think would be a good opportunity. So people have a few other questions outside of addresses. Someone was asking if there are comparable resources for other parts of the US.
Yeah, that's a great question. It is so yes and no. There are some other options like Old Maps Online, which is a repository of lots of old maps that you can use, and it includes places that are beyond, Boston. If we came over here, we would see it's actively searching for maps, and many of these, I think, are georeferenced, but not all of them. There's another tool called Map Warper that is historically a georeferencing tool for both accessing georeferenced maps and georeferencing your own maps. Both of these tools have got limitations. Basically, this is an issue of scale. AtlasScope is extremely is very neat, right? And the user interface we think is pretty intuitive. But it focuses on a rather small geography, right? Just the city of Boston, just fire insurance and real estate maps. We made that decision pretty intentionally because we didn't want to clutter it up with too much information, which is what I think old maps online and Map Warper can suffer from. But if you are interested in looking at some other maps that have already been georeferenced, these tools should be useful for you. I'll also make a note of some ongoing work that we're doing at the Map Center around georeferencing and building out a next generation georeferencing tool. Allmaps.org is a website that is currently under development by a programmer and map enthusiast named Bert Spahn, based in the Netherlands. Bert has been working on all maps for a little over a year now, and we've partnered to support his work at the Map Center because we think that the georeferencer that he's building is really exciting and really applicable to our institution as well as a variety of other ones. Skipping over some of the sort of technical details of this tool, if you know of a map that you want to see overlaid on a real geography, you can use the All Maps editor to drop a map in. So for example, if we went to the Leventhal Map Center's website, let's actually go to our collections portal. And we can do some maps of Boston. Let's do the North End and see what happens.
Sorry, so we have someone who wants to know, what is map warping?
Map Warper is just the name of the website, but the work that it's describing is georeferencing, which basically is the workflow that AtlasScope is based on. It's the process of computationally attaching latitudes and longitudes to scanned map images so that a computer knows where it overlays in the actual world, right? If we're looking at a map like this of the South End Renewal area, a computer looks at this and sees a JPEG, or a TIFF file. There's no spatial data actually attached to this. But we can use software like QGIS, for example, which is the software that we use to run this workflow at the Map Center, to transform or warp these older maps onto modern geographies, so that you end up with something like this, where they overlay with a modern map. Hopefully that's helpful, Karen.
Okay, great. Okay, so we do have one more, I'm seeing one more request for a specific address. They're looking for 16 Harcourt Street in Boston.
Great, 16 Harcourt. Let's take a look at it. Super. So this one also back to 1874. Right, we're down by Huntington Avenue. Just let me know if there's a particular time, but I'd also be easy to just walk all the way through. So 1874, this is, sorry, I look sort of goofy right now. Franklin Haven and others trustees, it looks like. So a big chunk of this property is owned by the same property owner. Skipping ahead to 1882, it looks like we might be in a similar boat, right at the intersection of the Boston, Albany, and Providence railroads. Makes this in all sorts of ways a desirable location. 1898. All right, so we got some pretty rapid development here. Was there anything in between? 1890, this 1888. Yeah, okay. Right, so 1883 is when we start to see some property actually parceled out. It still looks like it's like a great deal of it is owned by Franklin Haven trustees. And yeah, we still got the Boston Providence Railroad right there and the Boston Albany line. But by the time we get to 1890, we actually have, it looks like an MIT building right here. Coolidge owns this property at Harcourt in 1890. Jumping ahead to 1908, Charles Bond garage. I'm not sure. In 1908, I'm not totally sure what the garage would have referred to. So that's kind of interesting. Bring it up to 1912. Might have been for vehicles, cars. And I think that this property is staying pretty consistent once it comes into the Bond I think that probably means TRS typically means trust or trustees, I think. David Huntley Inc. By 1928 and by 1938, we've got still back in bond. So a little bit of hot potato with this property between a couple of the same owners over the last chunk here. But yeah, right up against the railroad. Yeah, it's always I wish that we could. It's nice when we can have folks in the audience chime in and give some sort of context for these guesses. So if you all, or for these searches. So if you have any interesting discoveries on Atlascope that you would like to share, or feel free to reach out to us and kind of tell us stories about searching and using Atlascope in different ways.
So we do have a couple of questions. So Michael is asking, what are the best resources for finding old photos of Boston and surrounding areas? Is there a way of finding a place? Excuse me. Is there a way of finding a place on Atlascope and immediately going to extant old photos?
Michael, that is a great question. So Digital Commonwealth is probably one of the best places for finding old photos of Boston. It's the resource we mentioned a little bit earlier. I'll close out of this Durant search here. Digital Commonwealth is, Megan talked about this a little bit earlier. And Megan, feel free to chime in if you want to give, if I miss any context here. But it is it's basically a coalition of different libraries, museums, and cultural institutions in the state of Massachusetts that is not like part of the Boston Public Library per se, but the BPL houses a lot of these contents and manages a lot of these images and items. So you can search for our map collection in here. The Map Center is part of Digital Commonwealth, but we have almost 1 million items and objects as part of digitized as part of this collection. So if you want, I like to scroll through photos for, where do I search? Right here, basic. So I like to search for computer and just look at some of the old like mainframe and analog computers that they have in here, about 1,000 entries. Lots of fun. So I would say this is probably a great resource for photos. In terms of how that combines with Atlascope, there is not currently a way of finding a place on Atlascope and immediately going to extant photos. But I will say not yet. It is very specific.
On that.
Yeah, it's very specifically something that we've talked about implementing, partially because a lot of these photos, they're tagged with pretty robust metadata. Many of them are associated with specific places. And so it is totally conceivable and feasible to incorporate some of these items into Atlascope, and we've actually tested that in-house, but it is not at a point where we can release it publicly yet. So Michael, keep your eyes peeled. We hope to release some of those features in the future.
All right. So we have another question here. Eric is asking, is there any intention to extend Atlascope into colonial times? Could an ancient map and shorelines be stretched and reshaped to fit and align with modern maps?
Yeah, that's also a great question. I'll answer this in two parts. The answer to your first question, specifically with Atlascope, is no. Like I said before, we intentionally chose the scope or the scale of Atlascope to be relatively granular. Even if we extend it to Massachusetts or the entire United States, it would be great to have an Atlascope for the entire country. I think we would still focus primarily on sort of block level and parcel level geographies based on fire insurance and real estate maps, because you run the risk of cluttering the interface and making it sort of difficult to figure out what it's useful for if you add too much of that information. That said, you certainly can georeference an ancient map or a colonial map and see how it aligns with modern geographies. For example, we have at the Map Center, let's go back to our search here. You can query only maps that have been georeferenced in our collections. Let's just clear this search and go down here. If I click on this yes right here, we only see maps that have been georeferenced. Many of these are modern, but many of them are pretty old. We have maps that are georeferenced that date back to 1609, it looks like. If we change that time filter, we can go here and take a look at the map overlay and see how this lays down on an actual geography. So this is totally possible, right? You can toggle the opacity here and see that. The one caveat with this is that the further back in time you go, the weirder the map will look when it is georeferenced. Because if you can believe it, surveying methods, were not as good in 1300 or 1500 as they are today. So some of these maps don't actually align very well with modern geographies, which makes them warp in ways that are fun and interesting, but not always super legible. So hopefully that's helpful, Eric.
So I just put a link in the chat to a website that's run by the Boston Planning and Development Agency. So they have it's not quite as good as Atlascope, but they do have a similar site, and they do have some colonial maps on there. It's not perfectly lined up because there are issues, particularly with all the landfill projects, but you can get a sense at least of being able to compare different time periods going back to the colonial era. So I just wanted to pop that in.
Yeah. Map Junction is a great resource. I should have mentioned
it
that
is
one.
great, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have another request for an address. It's 10 Guest Street in Brighton.
Super. I still haven't stopped thinking about that South Margin Street. Once we get off this call, I'm gonna have to go find it.
I have something on that when we're done with this one.
Okay, super. Let's take a look at Guest Street. Oh, cool. So this is right at Brighton Station in 1875. I have to admit, I moved to Boston in last September, so I'm still fairly new to the city and learning about the history. So I guess I apologize that I can't quite narrate a lot of the moving through time on Atlascope in ways that a true sort of Boston historian would be able to. But it's really exciting when you get someone who knows in even greater detail some of these areas and these histories. Yeah, but jumping ahead, so we've got Brighton Station in 1882, right up against the water here. Let's zoom back in. 1885, a bank appears. Interesting. We're starting to get it. Is that? No, it's Walker. Sorry, I thought that was a cartographer in the 19th century for a second. Yeah, it looks like this has been surveyed out, but probably doesn't actually exist yet. By 1909. So they have National Market Bank. 1916, 1925. One thing that that is particularly interesting to look in Brighton about is this this neck of the woods over here. So we're right next to it at Guest Street. Brighton, some of you might know that it was historically the slaughtering district of Boston. So Brighton, there's a great book about animals in cities. And a wonderful article about animal suburbs by a professor who's local here, who's written about this slaughtering district, basically, the abattoir. I think that's how it's pronounced. I don't speak French, but it looks like a French word. Anyway, if we scroll through time here, We can see some of the developments in the slaughtering and meeting association. I mean, this whole district in Brighton was very much an undesirable place to be, foul smelling, and typically to be avoided by citizens. But Brighton wasn't incorporated until the early 1900s, I don't think. So it was
no, it was Hyde Park was the most recent one. Brighton. I live in Brighton myself. So
okay, yeah. Yeah, I feel like
that was incorporated in. So that was annexed in 1874.
Oh, 1874. Okay.
Yeah, that's when it was annexed.
Gotcha. This is I need I need some local insight for some of these. But yeah, it's really interesting to look through some of the ways that the butchers and slaughtering corporations have sort of evolved over time.
Especially interesting. So there's a restaurant called the Stockyard where their stockyards used to be.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting.
It's a steakhouse.
Yeah, naturally. I mean, what else could it be?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, so for South Margin, so we have a book called The Records of Streets of Boston that was produced in 1907. So it's really good for figuring out where streets that no longer exist used to be.
Okay.
So South Margin, it says it ran from 52 Pitt Street to 16 Prospect Street.
Let's try 60 Prospect in
16 Prospect.
What was the other one? The other street?
52 Pitts Street.
Interesting.
So yeah, it can be kind of a downer when none of the reference streets are there anymore. So I don't know how helpful that's going to be. Because that looks like it just threw you down somewhere else.
Yeah, down in Quincy, I think we
So
landed.
it says, again, I don't know if how helpful this is, how familiar you are. It says it was laid out across the mill pond.
Oh yeah, okay.
So it was around the Bullfinch Triangle, I think.
Yeah, that is down. Is that down here? Mill Pond. Someone on this call is probably pulling their hair out as I try to drive through this atlas so poorly.
So just related to that, so Amy who asked about this, she did put her email address in the Q&A. If you are able to find it, you can get back to her. So she did put her information in the box. So yeah, I've encountered this myself where I have folks asking about they can't find their ancestor's house on a map. They can't find the street on a map and they want to know where it was. And it takes a long time to find it because all the references are also no longer there. Mm-hmm. So, but I'm sure we'll be able to locate it eventually. Just maybe not in the time we have now.
Yeah. Yeah, one of the, there's Leverett though. I should probably, yeah, I'll put this away for now. But hopefully we can track it down and get back to you, Amy. And Amy, if you find it before we do, don't hesitate to reach out.
Definitely. Let me see. If any more questions? Okay, so let's see. We have someone asking about the Great Molasses Flood. Can you look for disasters during a relative's time?
Yeah, so the Molasses Flood is down. Is that on the north end? I think.
Yeah, that was in the north end. That was right on the waterfront.
Yeah,
I believe it's a playground now.
Molasses Flood. Let's see what we've got.
529 Commercial Street. That's about where it was.
559 Commercial.
529 Commercial.
Oh, there we go. So the earliest we've got is Gaslight Company here. This is interesting to see on a lot of these historic maps, a lot of these atlases where oil and gas were refined and processed. That's another thing that we tackle in the current exhibition, sort of thinking about how we can use these maps to place industry in relation to different different neighborhoods in the city of Boston, especially Chelsea and East Boston we focus on in the exhibition. So just a little north of here, but jumping up to 95. Yep, still the Gaslight Company. Feel free to chime in if you see any. I can't believe I haven't looked at the.
Sorry, I muted myself. So the
molasses.
molasses flood was in 1919, so it probably would start showing up right around there. I believe that's the tank. That circle is the tank that exploded.
Oh, this one right here.
Yes,
Yeah.
that is it. Yes.
Yes.
Mhm.
That's the one.
So it's the Elevated Railway Company is the.
Well,
is-
that's well, so they were right next to the rail yard. It was
Yeah.
the
Oh yeah,
the company was
1922, that
called.
goes away.
It was the United Industrial Alcohol, something or other, something like that. That they were right next to the rail yard.
Yeah. Yep. Between 1917 and 1922, that
Yeah. See,
that
it's
tank
disappeared.
is disappeared for sure. Really
Yes.
interesting. Gasometer. I haven't heard that word before. I saw in the chat that someone wanted to see, I feel like, maps of Situate. Oh, and Megan, oh, you already made your way to it. Super. I was just gonna say if
Yeah.
Megan hasn't cops to being a Situate.
Yeah, Megan was on it.
Yeah, super.
We actually just acquired, I think, a new Situate map. So coming soon might be on the digital collections, but we'll have to wait a little bit to see if it comes through.
There is super Megan. Oh, you've already caught up on all of the chat stuff. Yeah, the looking through the histories of the railway companies and the railroads is really prominent across all of Atlascope, just because of the footprint of those industries at the turn of the century, and also, like I said before, because a lot of they're often very identifiable in terms of building structures. These very round, like these right here, these very round, round. They're called a roundhouse, I guess. Turntables and rail changing stations. Yeah.
I do just want to say quickly before we wrap up that all of the tools that we looked at today, all of our resources are entirely free and open to the public. We encourage you to use them as much as you want. Spend hours on Atlascope. We can be reached at info@leventhalmap.org, or our personal emails are in the chat as well. And if you ever find yourself in Copley, please do swing by the Map Center and ask for either Ian or I, and we would love to connect with you and help wrap up some research that you're doing. That's what we love to do. So, and thank you everyone for coming. This was so great.
I'll also, while we're wrapping up, I'll do a little bit of shameless self-promotion that we have a couple of events coming up. Keep an eye out for, Megan, you can double check the dates on this for me, but we've been doing some Atlascope trivia nights at Newsfeed, during which you can stop by and meet folks at the Map Center, the wonderful people at Newsfeed and our partner organizations. And so when is the next one, Megan? Can you give us some details on that?
Absolutely. The next one is on Thursday, July 28th at 6 p.m. and it's on the history of Boston Transit. So we'll be looking a lot at railroad construction, using Atlascope to track where things were built, what was there before then, and some trick questions in there. But yes, we would love to see you all there. We just had one on Olmsted's Boston landscapes, which was very fun. But yes, some good things coming up.
Yeah, so these are always a blast. We'd love to see you there. And they do open up Newsfeed for cocktail consumption, if that is something you're interested in. So it is a lot of fun. And there are prizes for winners, in case anyone is curious. There are map forward prizes.
Excellent. All right, so
ahead and stop
I think
this.
that just about does it. So again, I will be emailing everyone a link to the chat transcript in a few minutes once I download it. And I will be emailing a link to this recording to everyone once it's ready. Again, it might take a little while. Our AV folks are incredibly busy these days. And oh, looks like someone's asking what that display is behind you, Megan.
Well, admittedly, this is not my office. This is our president and head curator's office. But Ian, do you know what this one is? Is it?
I
It's
think
Boston. It's a very large map of Boston.
it looks like there might be a little description on the right-hand side. Is that for the map?
You're right.
Okay, yeah.
I will read it. It's an 1852 map of the city of Boston and immediate neighborhood. And the description says, depicted in great detail on this large, I'll show you the map while I'm talking. Large detail is the continued physical growth of the city of Boston and urban development in the area surrounding its busy harbor. I will quickly search the collections website and see if I can find that for you. And I'll send the link right now.
All right, so while she's doing that, I'll continue my little closing spiel. So I'll be sending everyone an email in a few minutes with a link to the chat transcript and a link to the handout in case anyone missed it. So sadly, this is our last family history lecture for the spring. We will be back in the fall. So definitely keep an eye on our events calendar for that. We will be back with more events. And now I'm just going to thank you so much, Ian and Megan. This was wonderful. I'm getting a lot of positive comments in the chat. I think everyone really enjoyed it. So, and thank you to everyone who attended, especially those of you who stayed for the whole 90 minutes. That shows amazing dedication. We appreciate that. And just everyone have a good night and have a great summer.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.